right, welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, I don't have the energy that my other co-host, DJ, has on cab. I was trying to channel a little bit of his enthusiasm to kick this episode off because we are going to talk about channeling today. So I'm very excited to get into that. But before we do, I want to catch up with you really quick. How's it been? What's going on? Just another normal day in the woods where you are. Give us an update.
Right, you could say that or not. Yeah, it's been. I've hinted before, if not said outright, just how synchronistically orchestrated everything seems to be over the last year and a half or so, and I've mentioned how 2023 seems to be kicking off at an even greater pace than 2022, which seems, impossible. And yet it seems to be the case, and that has not let up. The last week's probably been one of the craziest weeks of my life, if not number one, which is saying a lot. So in light of the last year, so yeah, I'm doing great. How you doing?
I'm great, man. I'm great. I'm here to kind of mellow out your insane experiences because my life is totally pretty normal. Nothing crazy happening. Just usual work, family obligations. And enjoying some of this warmer weather. I guess it's about to get a little bit cool again. So you and I both will be getting a little cold snap over the next couple of days. But it seems like winter is on the way out and spring is on the way in, which I'm very excited about. Other than the pollen, I just can't stand the pollen. But I love seeing things grow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're going to jump into a topic that I know a lot of folks are interested in. I certainly am interested in it, and it's not a topic without some degree of controversy, which of course is pretty much every topic that we touch on has some level of controversy around it. But this one in particular can get pretty heated, even amongst those who are into this broad topic of ufology or phenomenology, and that's the topic of channeling. And so we're going to cover, I think, a pretty good bit of territory here with respect to this issue. And I know you've got some unique insight on it. And we also want to kind of land as well at the end of the episode on how it fits into the sort of overall cosmology that we have about the nature of reality. But maybe we can start with a definition, which you shared with me. And I like this definition. I think it's pretty fitting. So I'm going to read it here. Channeling is the process of revealing information and energy not limited by our conventional notions of space and time that can appear receptive or expressive. So a couple of different interesting tidbits there to dig into. The one that jumps out at me right away is not limited to sort of space and time, this sort of non-local quality of information. But when you dig into this, as you and I have, you find there are lots of different definitions for channeling there, and it goes by many different names as well. So even if the word channeling might be off-putting to some of our audience, we might use a different phrase, and they might go, "Oh, well, yeah, I get that. I have that all the time." So to some degree, it's about how you package it. So what are your thoughts on kind of the word itself, how it's used, and where people are just in general being receptive to this notion of channeling information that comes from somewhere other than maybe the immediate self?
Right, and I think we will probably go back and forth on this a little bit for a while, because I think we kind of want to describe the general territory and then talk about different ways that channeling can be described within that larger territory, because this kind of falls within general kind of psychic phenomena in general and psi phenomena in general. Sometimes when people think of channeling, they think of what is more specifically defined as like trance channeling, where you kind of go into a trance state and basically some sort of other being, sometimes a non-corporeal kind of being or an alien intelligence, will actually basically take over your body and be able to use your muscles and your vocal cords to make sounds and to actually generate speech. Often there's this sense that even it's limited to the vocabulary of the person who's the receptive nature or receptive vessel for the channeling, right? So it might be really complex scientific or technical information, which the being that's doing the channeling has a hard time expressing based on the limited vocabulary of the person. Other times there's cases like in the raw material where they seem to be able to access the entire history of the English language. But because they do so, and because the English language has evolved over time, they will sometimes use these old English words that haven't been used for like 150 years or something, to the point where the people actually being involved in the channeling session have to go find old dictionaries and look this up and figure out what the heck did we just say, So that's really interesting. But yeah, in that more narrow definition of trance channeling, basically either you have a situation where it's almost like the person goes into a sleep state or dormant state where they sometimes are not even aware of what's going on. They have to be told afterwards, what happened, and they have to listen to a tape because sometimes they don't even remember what was said through them, basically through their vocal cords. Other times, more recently, it's described more like you sort of step aside and you can witness some other kind of intelligence working through your body, moving your vocal cords, but you really feel like you're accessing it like a witness. So that's trance channeling. And so some people want us to define it that way, but the reason we defined it the way that you did, which I'm just going to read it one more time, channeling is the process of revealing information and energy not limited by our conventional notions of space and time that can appear receptive or expressive. Now, there's some experts in the field, even within the Institute of Noetic Sciences, who've actually come up with that definition. So that's why I actually trust that. This is people who have spent decades studying this, PhD level people who are saying this is the best definition they have of what channeling actually is. And trance channeling is a more specific kind within that. So, and of course, the reason why you hinted already, space and time, this is really key here, the notion of non-local consciousness, right? And once you establish that that's probably the case, that our consciousness is not combined or confined within our mind or brain, within our skull, then suddenly that opens up all sorts of possibilities. And really channeling, along with all of this kind of psi phenomena, very much says to us that physicalism, as we've said before, is not tenable, because these phenomena simply cannot exist if physicalism is true. And yet we have so much research that's been done by ions, by Dean Radin, people like that, to suggest to us this is absolutely true. This is actually saying something fundamental about reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the critique that's leveled to this many times is that, how is this really different from just using your imagination? Right. So when somebody says, I had this revelation come to me, this insight, this detailed knowledge, and it just sort of came out of me. I don't know where it came from. Well, the skeptic will say, well, I mean, the mind's very powerful and you just imagined it. And, that's what happened here. It's not something that, that's something spooky about it. It just kind of came out of your subconscious or what have you. But that definition is kind of interesting, or perception is kind of interesting, because some of the output from channeling or instances like that are quite extraordinary, that I think the person giving the information would argue like they literally have no corollary in their lived experience by which to generate that kind of content. And that does certainly, I think, raise some questions, right? It's like, my imagination's pretty good, but I mean, I can't just, create some elaborate, complex ideas out of the ether, if we're just talking about imagination here. So that, I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, some of the critique of this idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just like I alluded to a minute ago with the sort of confines of physicalism and the assumptions and the presuppositions about the nature of reality and the nature of what's possible within physicalism. So if that is someone's model, though, they believe that accurately depicts reality, then they have to come up with some reason why people are having these experiences, right? And so delusion, imagination, whatever comes to mind for them to try to explain what's going on. But as you say, that doesn't really deal with the data, because some of the data suggests that we really do get information that either doesn't seem to be normally attainable by anyone. For instance, it could be something to do with future information, which no one has access to generally. according to this model anyway, physicalism. But like you say, also sometimes people will receive information that is far beyond what they could make up, even if they, read science fiction their entire lives. I know cases personally where people who have no scientific background really are suddenly channeling differential equations, like really advanced quantum physics. So I know personally that I've seen this happen, and it's not just what I've seen in people around me, but this has been well documented that this happens. I also want to point out too, based on something you said there, as I've pointed out before, any kind of event is always an interpreted experience, right? So we never just have a raw experience and just explain it to people as if we're just being completely objective. We're always putting it through some sort of filter. And so what's interesting is even when you ask people who are channelers, who experience channeling, they themselves will have different answers as to where they think it's coming from. And really comes down to what they believe the possibilities are, based on their model of reality. So some people think that they are getting it from their own subconscious, but that there's a much more robust knowledge base that we're aware of. Other people think they're getting it from the collective unconscious, like kind of a Jungian kind of perspective. Other people think they're getting it from their higher self. And then other people think they're getting it from alien intelligences. So it really, and some are all the above, right? Spirit guides, right? So it speaks to just how broad and deep the possibilities are. And you know me by now, my answer is going to be it's all of the above. That this is just the nature of reality, is incredibly rich and diverse with all these different kinds of intelligences. And as we progress along the consciousness spectrum, we become aware of and can interact with and draw from more and more of these other pools of information. And again, whether you call it the Akashic records or the cosmic memory or whatever, ultimately, like I've said before, any bit of information from any space and any time is always available. That's the fundamental truth that gets revealed in all of this psi phenomena. And of course, that's paradigm shattering stuff.
It certainly is. Well, and maybe we could speak a little bit to the ways in which channeling appears in human history. And here I'm thinking of let's talk about Christianity. We kind of go there fairly often, but the idea of divine inspiration, a lot of, and not just with Christianity, but a lot of the kind of different religious traditions have a concept like this, where some kind of divine information is received by, a devout person, or maybe someone who's not devout at all. And then that information just kind of flows from them in different forms, whether they can be sort of prophetic pronouncements. A lot of the prophets certainly would say that it's not their message that they're giving, it's some other message that's coming out of them. But in the Christian tradition specifically as well, we have this notion of a divinely inspired text, that it's sort of written by human hands, but they're not the individuals that originated these ideas. They sort of flowed just through them onto the page. So whether you kind of adhere to that or not, that's just one example of where, human culture, we have pointed to this kind of inspiration or, non-local information just, arising on the scene. But we've got a lot more recent examples as well within, human art and music. We've got lots of examples of musicians who just kind of say, like, I don't know where this song came from. I just sat down and it came out, and I don't know where the tune came from or the lyrics. Like, none of it makes sense to me when I look at it and I'm reading it, but here it is, and it ends up being a tremendous hit. And I've also heard as well, not in the kind of an art example, but in science examples, there are many scientists who have these same kinds of aha moments or things just kind of appear to them, and they end up being like dramatic, world-changing kinds of concepts. And I've even heard too that some of these scientists don't want to talk publicly about how they obtained this information, because it is unaccepted in the circles that they traffic in. And so people just sort of attribute them to being kind of a genius, but really If you get them in private and they kind of talk about how they arrived at that conclusion or what have you, they'll tell you they have no idea. It just kind of came to them out of nowhere. So we have a lot of examples here of the notion of channeling, but kind of packaged in ways that are more socially acceptable. So this seems to have been like a part of us for a very long time, but it's just in the last maybe 50 years, a little bit more than that perhaps, where we've kind of looked at channeling as like this, really bizarre, sort of new age, thing that, if you call it that, well, I don't want anything to do with that. That's not something that I'm okay with. If we're talking about intuition or inspiration, well, yeah, I mean, I have that. I'm totally fine with that. So it's just interesting how we applied the stigma to different ways of packaging the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to touch on a couple things you said there. We want to get into the Christianity thing for a second because there's some really interesting nuances there. But I would say here to your point there about, we're okay saying I was inspired or, I had an intuition or hunch, right? A gut hunch, whatever. We're very familiar with that. And that's become okay in our culture, right? It's a normative way to speak. And we actually even mean kind of that, somehow it's something of it beyond the normal way you would gather information through your usual senses or by reading it or something or hearing it. But, when you think about like the DSM, the manual to do with whether or not someone gets diagnosed with a particular psychological condition or something, what you'll find there is that there's a spectrum, right? And so somebody might have obsessive compulsive tendencies. In fact, most people might have some degree of that. And whether or not you end up with a diagnosis really comes down to how disruptive it is to your life. If it prevents you from living the life you'd want to, a productive life according to how you would define it, then that's kind of when it goes into that territory. But everyone is somewhere in the range though, and it's a spectrum, right? So it's not like there's these black and white lines. This person is obsessive compulsive. This person has absolutely none of that, right? And it's the same thing here. That the truth is, every human being has some degree of psychic capacity. Again, it's not just me saying it because I like the idea, but the research of people like Dean Radin have made this abundantly clear. And if anybody has doubts about any of this stuff, I would say do a deep dive into Dean Radin's work. Look at his books. He's very diligent about not only showing the results he's come across, and these have been very rigorous protocols applied to these, but even the meta-analyses of multiple studies, which is even more trustworthy, and it shows how much this really is the case. But to your point about Christianity, what's really interesting here is, like you say, there's some nuances to get into here. We have to stop off here because this is such a regular stop for us on the train route. Because on the one hand, as we've talked about, it's very ironic that we are okay saying, whether it's Moses or the Apostle Paul or Jesus or, John the Baptist, it's okay if those guys, right, have these, profound experiences, right? If they have these like direct experiences of something beyond, right? That's okay. And then they end up talking about it. It gets written down. It gets kind of cataloged and turned into a series of do's and don'ts that become like the eternal laws kind of thing that we all follow. In other words, by the time they get to us, they're very safe and tame and unchanging. But really, that again says something more about us. I think that we, and this has kind of been demonstrated throughout the history of mankind, that we tend to not want the untamed wildness of that direct experience of something beyond, something sublime. And to that point, even though Christianity and other kinds of inspired religions began with those kinds of experiences of people, Christianity later on conducted things like the Inquisition and witch trials, right? And put to death huge numbers of people who showed the capacities that they could have these sublime experiences and tap into something beyond, to the point where you can even see a dip in psychic capacity across the civilization because of how many literally people were put to death in those kinds of things. And so the thing we used to call the means by which prophets worked suddenly became, oh, but if it's a witch, or if it's someone who's not specifically giving either Christian doctrine or a very specific version of Christian doctrine that fits our particular view, then it's it's from the devil, right? So in other words, they do believe it's still coming from somewhere else, but suddenly now they just go, but it's dark, it's not good, it's from the devil, right? So rather than seeing that actually this is just something that's fundamental to being human. In fact, it's fundamental to being a sentient being, that everything's connected. And we can all tap into this, and this has always been the case. So it's a very interesting thing when you think about Christianity and the history and how it began, and that it became the very thing that it railed against and even, killed people over later on.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about the funny way that orthodoxy develops, and heresy it comes into that conversation, and it changes over time as well. But so much of that is tied to this need for power and control, not about what's really happening, right? And so I think that that's a good lesson to learn from Christianity if we apply that to this topic as well, right? Because we tend to kind of encamp, we kind of get into our little tribes of thinking about what can happen or can't happen, is possible. We set up the boundaries of what is possible, and what this type of knowledge or experience or informational modality presents to us is, really is that kind of seed of heresy or heterodoxy that kind of just like it intersects into our normal way of being. We have to make room for that, and if we're not making room for it, well, then we're going to do what we've always done, and that is, stamp it out as much as possible. Plug our ears. It's not happening, and that's certainly something that we've seen with the rise of scientism. In the modern world, is that no, information can't come to us in this way. It just can't. That's not something that can happen. So, it's impossible. And yet the impossible continues to happen all the time. And even those that kind of proclaim that very loudly, this can't happen. They, I think, in the quiet of their own lives, find many experiences where these kinds of things happen all of the time. And imagine kind of living in that life, having to essentially like negate that and say, well, I'm denying a part of myself that is very much real and experienced, because it just doesn't fit within the model that I have defined as being true, right, possible. So much of this is that it's, again, we've talked about that this many times, but kind of the possibility space.
Yeah, and to your point there, I think I want to bring up something that's very important. I think will surprise some people, because we were just talking about there how science wants to say this is not possible. Now, what's very interesting is you can actually see scientific proof or evidence for these kind of giftings through typical scientific means, is what I mean. So, for instance, IONS has done studies where they look into people who have psychic functioning versus those who don't. And first of all, it's very, very difficult to find people who don't. And there's a variety of reasons or ways that they would sort of find these two pools, right? So you've got your control group, and then you've got your people who actually seem to have some sort of psychic capacity. So they went through and they found a group of people who both had passed a battery of tests that demonstrated they were good at, clairsentience, clairvoyance, different kinds of telekinesis, all sorts of different things demonstrating that they really did have psi capacity. They had to demonstrate it, and they also talked to people that knew them. They had to get, sort of verified that people had experiences with them, kind of thing. So that's how they created the group that would be demonstrating the psi capacity. Then it was very, very difficult to find people who didn't have some memory of experiencing things in non-conventional ways, information in non-conventional ways. Very, very difficult, or at least, and even more so to find people who didn't have brothers or sisters or mothers or fathers who also hadn't had those experiences. But they eventually found a control group. And what they found was very interesting. It wasn't just that some people have psychic capacities that was demonstrable scientifically, right, with rigorous protocols in place, people. I want to make this really clear. This is not just hearsay. It's not just anecdotal evidence, right? This is lab-tested results with rigorous protocols. And most people that are conducting parapsychological research know that it's going to be mocked and immediately dismissed. So they have some of the most rigorous protocols you can find. I don't think you'll be able to convince me that Dean Radin doesn't do that, for instance, really set up rigorous protocols. But what they found is not just that, sure enough, the people who were known to be psychic achieved much better on these tests, did much better, but on top of that, they could actually see differences in their genetics. They could see differences in their brain. So, for instance, they would see evidence of a particular chromosome that had to do with what we used to consider junk DNA, right? That was what we used to call it, because which is again, is our hubris, right? We can't immediately figure out what this is for, so it's just a bunch of stuff that's garbage, right? I don't even know what it's doing there, right? And of course, the more logical conclusion is we just don't know enough yet to know what it's doing, right? And so sure enough, in recent years, we've made progress. We're beginning to understand some of the ways that non-coding DNA is what it's called now, as opposed to junk DNA. We've grown up a little bit. They recognize it can influence the brain and the body, but in ways that's different than coding DNA. And so it's in that non-coding DNA that we used to call junk DNA that we actually see a difference in the brains of people who have psychic capacity. And even more fascinatingly, the people who actually didn't have psychic capacity, they actually had a mutation, meaning that the original human genome had this within it. And it was a later mutation, even possibly because of things like inquisitions and witch trials, that actually eventually you had so many people murdered that had those natural capacities that were part of the original genome eliminated from the gene pool. So then people who had the mutation started having kids with people who had that same mutation. And then we then have a pool of people who have this mutation, which makes them actually not as psychically capable, which is really fascinating when you think about it. And that not only this is something that exists, but actually this was the original. And the people who don't have this is more of a recent mutation, and because a direct consequence of our persecuting of this thing that's actually natural to the human genome.
That's sobering to say the least. That we would, well, of course, then there are many examples in our history where we have, selectively taken things out that we just don't like, we just disagree with. But it does seem to be, as you said earlier, something that we all possess, that everyone has some degree of experience that can be bucketed into what we would call channeling. And I find it interesting how modern people kind of navigate their life, even though they've had these experiences, like how they kind of bucket those experiences, like segment them from everything else that happens, So, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone, I think, if you really asked them, have you had any, like an intuition about somebody that later turned out to be true? Have you had a precognitive experience where you knew something, and then not long after you knew it, you learned it for the first time, through conventional means? These experiences are, I would argue, almost fundamental to being human, and yet because they are so strange and the way that we have been taught we can experience things, they're all just written off by our science, essentially, as saying like, well, it's just, weird things happen in the brain, so the brain is just kind of it's mysterious, we don't understand it all, so it can kind of just come up with this stuff, and with enough people doing enough thinking, weird things happen, and that's just it's almost like a rounding error to some degree. But if we were to kind of dig into this in a serious way, because there are a lot of people who do study this and try to develop this ability, what are some different ways that you know of that individuals try to nurture and enhance this capacity that we seemingly all share?
It's a great question. And I think there are some very practical things people can do, and they're not all that, startling and, big league. In some ways, you can begin in some very small ways, because, as we're saying, this is something about the fundamental nature of reality, the fundamental default condition of humanity. So a lot of it comes down to us just being out of practice, right? Or having a muscle that we never exercise, right? If you go to space and you don't have to resist gravity, right? Your muscles, just go to nothing, right? I mean, you basically have to try to create an artificial environment to keep your muscles strong. Well, in the same way, because of the, progress we've made as a civilization, we have a safety net, and we are not concerned generally that a lion's going to come up from behind that bush and devour us. Although I did have a mountain lion chase me one time, I will say. So that being the case, we tend to not rely on these capacities, right? So I've mentioned before, and it's worth mentioning again in this context, that Joe McMoneagle's talked about this. He has remarkable psi capacity, and it's not coincidental. From his point of view, it has a lot to do with the fact that he grew up on the main streets of Miami, where you needed to know what was around that corner because it could be life-threatening. It could be a street gang with knives. So to keep he and his sister safe, he kind of developed this sixth sense, right? And, people in parapsychology will actually talk about, we should really call it the first sense, because it's actually the most rooted aspect of who we are. But again, in physicalism, it's kind of been badmouthed and, excommunicated kind of thing. But the thing is, this is really about being aware of how you receive information in non-conventional ways. So the ways you can practice this, actually discerning and feeling what it's like when you feel like you're getting information that is not typical or conventional or prosaic, is when you go to make small decisions and you have a couple options. Sit with how each one feels. Sit with it. Don't rush, right? I mean, this is part of the problem, is our lives are so busy, our modern lives. And the second we get time off, we want to stream media content and we want to get on social media. And I'm not saying those things are all bad, but I'm saying if you constantly fill your life with activity, then you're not going to be able to drill down and experience and grow these much more subtle capacities. Because this is, to be clear, this is a subtle level of reality. And one of the things I've been practicing with someone I'm really close to is being able to do this at greater and greater degrees of subtlety. And what I've found is astonishing, and I really think that's the right word, is there doesn't seem to be a limit. The second you think you've hit this limit of like, there's another granular level we can go to here in subtle understanding of this 1 millisecond has so much information packed into it. And we just rush past it, right? On a kind of a one single level kind of way, one dimensional. But if you can stop and you can feel into it, especially if you can do it with someone like I was doing with her, where we could basically telepathically have this experience of unpacking this moment. And it created this kind of resonant field where it held the moment in stasis, so we could suddenly like look around it like it's a room. And it was an amazing experience. And I've never quite had that degree of experience. So that is to say, all of us can not only experience this, but we can continue to grow it and have increasingly phenomenal experiences. But even if you've never done this before, just begin by, when you go and you look in the fridge, should I eat this or should I eat that? Yes, part of it might be, yeah, my doctor said that's high cholesterol, I shouldn't do that. But there might be something else, right? There might be something else beyond what you've been taught or read kind of thing that makes you think, actually, this over that. Or if you're thinking about moving to some place, right? Like you and I have talked about this. One of the ways you can sort of trick yourself into having this experience, because we're so conditioned to think that everything is rational and based on justification and pro-con list kind of thing. We've mentioned this before. So you sort of picture yourself moving to one of two cities, right? And rather than sitting down and writing up this pros and cons list, well, I like the weather here, but I like the traffic here, right? Actually picture yourself there 3 months from now. You wake up in the morning, stretch, look around. How do you feel? Like, try to place your consciousness in that moment. And by doing that, you will actually pull out information, whether it's subconscious or metaconscious, that is saying something about how you really interact with that possibility, that will demonstrate to you that you can access information that's not prosaic, that's not conventional, that's not determined by your usual senses. So this is key. Slow down, take time, notice how you have reactions to things, feel your body. This is another one. A new one that I came across recently was telesomatic experiences. And this is basically where people can get a stomach ache because their brother or their lover has a stomach ache kind of thing. And so they actually experience not just a gut instinct, but they actually take on the physical symptoms of someone they're close to or something like that. So we want to slow down. We want to, I've said this before, ideally practice meditation, right? Find ways to shut down the usual default thinking mode. And by doing that, our consciousness begins to expand outside of the usual borders that has been narrowly defined within. And then you begin to pick up additional information. So people often think, oh man, how do I do this? It seems so difficult. Really, a lot of the times it comes down to getting out of our own way. So by meditating, by just choosing to sit still, and yes, the monkey brain for a while is going to go, right? I've got to think about this. I got this meeting tomorrow. I got to get this done. I got to get groceries. But if you sit there long enough and you just watch it as a witness, without judging it, without trying to stop it, just let it run its course. Eventually, it will run its course because you're not paying it attention. You're not interacting with it. Eventually, it'll seem like it'll take a while sometimes for people first getting into this, but eventually the monkey mind will stop chattering because you stop talking to it. And then you will suddenly find that when that is out of your way, your consciousness will naturally begin to expand and you'll start picking up more and more things. So it can begin by, meditation practices, but then even as we walk around the world, just pay attention to what's in your body. Pay attention to when you get a gut instinct, what is that? Now, just sit with it. And as we begin to notice these things, we immediately begin to grow in our capacities. And then as we really begin to exercise that, then we really can, demonstrate some increased capacity over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to revisit the word and the definition that we use, and that's receptive. And so you're not only being open to what could happen, so there's a general openness that we've touched on here, that this is possible, but also being receptive in the sense that you're receiving information from somewhere else. So it really is kind of both ways of looking at it. And if you follow anyone who's, kind of tried to do this or develop this skill, being receptive is a huge aspect to their practice, that this can happen. I want to touch on another kind of modality as well, and that's, and you have touched on this a little bit, and that's through meditation, but there are altered states of consciousness that we can get into through not only meditation, but also things like psychedelics. And, we've seen plenty of examples of individuals that have had those experiences where things have happened to them that they can't quite explain through a conventional means. And I'll offer a recent anecdote of my own. So I was able to experience a really amazing altered state of consciousness with a good friend of mine, also in the mountains, not too far from your cabin, in fact. And, one of the interesting things about that experience was, well, there were several interesting things about it, but there are two that I want to touch on that I think tie directly into this topic. So one is a more abstract experience, and then one is a concrete one. So the abstract one that I had in this state was a sense that the way in which we know things, the way that we think we know things about the world, is not really how we know things. That knowledge instead is essentially all around us, ever present to us. Like we are traveling through a kind of like a medium of information. Like it just permeates everything about reality. Information is everywhere, and we can access that information at any point in time that we want to. It's just there. We just had to be present to that information, and we can access that. And then it's only after accessing the information and understanding it do we then kind of go back around and we say, well, I learned this through this sort of conventional way of learning. And so we kind of slap onto our intuition, our knowing, with sort of this schoolyard kind of, I learned it because I learned fact A, B, and C, and then put those together, and I'm going to get D. That's the way that I really understood this. So that was an interesting insight that I had in that moment. But the other one that was really the concrete example was, in this experience, out of nowhere, basically, I don't know where this came from. The thought entered my mind about my graduate school, and I was just kind of like, well, I wonder what's happening with my graduate school. It's been almost 20 years now since I finished that program. Wonder what they're up to, wonder what the campus looks like. I wonder if any of my professors are still there. Thoughts that I just never have ever about that, because it's been so long, and I don't stay in touch with any of them either. And after I kind of come out of this experience as altered state, I'm just like going through my phone like anybody else would. Like you said, we like to check those things and kind of fill our time. And I'm going through, I'm looking at my email, and the very first email that I have in my inbox is an email from my graduate school asking me to complete a survey for that graduating class year. Hey, we want to, find out what our alumni are up to from this year. It's been a long time since we've heard from you. Fill out this survey and let us know what you're doing. So that completely blew my mind in terms of an experience that I had never had, and was very precognitive. And you better believe I filled out that survey, and I put in some weird things in the survey response that they probably weren't expecting. But it's a good example of something that happened in my own personal experience, where this information just came to me. Like it was present to me, and I decided to be present to it. It was just there, and I did not learn it through any normal means of acquiring information. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of an experience that we had recently when you were telling me about that experience. So to sort of frame this for people, again, there's a lot of different topics that are kind of fall under this general umbrella about, psi and, non-conventional kind of means of experience, but also of knowledge. And again, we'll eventually get to how this plays into reality. Like, what is it about reality that makes these things possible? But another one that factors in here is synchronicity, right? That then this world is not exactly what it seems to be, and that you could call it a kind of matrix kind of situation, or kind of a derivative byproduct of some deeper structure of reality. And I've talked about this before. Again, there's physicists like Nima Arkani-Hamed who've been researching this, who are actually even making progress in beginning to have glimpses into this deeper structure of reality that we don't ever interact with directly, at least usually, because as you say, so through some of these non-conventional states, I think we can. But in our usual default mode, we generally don't. But if there is a deeper structure of reality, of which this is basically just the derivative byproduct of, then that would mean that the more you're in touch with something deeper, the more you might begin to see strange things appear here, not because the stage is here, but because this is a derivative of something deeper. So I think that's what's happening with synchronicity. I've talked about this before. I think the more our consciousness is engaged, the more that we really are able to, through a growth in consciousness, exceed the boundaries of space and time in the usual default mode. We impact that deeper structure in more substantive ways. And because of that, we see as a byproduct strange things occurring in this reality, right? This matrix, this physical reality, as we call it. And I think a lot of times that's what synchronicity is. Carl Jung had a somewhat similar idea that basically physical reality is the other side of the coin of the collective unconscious, right? That there are two sides of the same coin ultimately. But if you remember, you were telling me about this, I think around this time, we were having pizza and beer, and I had a beer, I don't think you did. Anyway, and we were talking about our histories, and I had mentioned to you this thing about, when I was a kid, my parents bought a Volkswagen van and we traveled across North America for like a year, camping in this van. It was like very hippie and very cool. And I had such great experiences of that, from that. And I looked behind you, like over your head, and in the parking lot across the street, it is the exact yellow Volkswagen van, 70s edition, European model. That was the very van that we drove across North America in. So that was, I'm like, you're not gonna believe this, Nathan, but look behind you. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not about magic. It's about that somehow ultimate reality is not this. And sometimes when we really are expanding our consciousness, we had just been talking about that, right, with your experience of an expanded consciousness state. And then this happens right after that. I think it's all connected.
Yeah, and I want to follow this a little bit further too, because it's not a sign that you should go and research vintage Volkswagen vans,
Right.
because a lot of people will construe it to be that, like, oh, I had this synchronicity, and that means that the universe wants me to study whatever it is that I had a synchronous experience with. Perhaps, I mean, it could be that, but more than likely it's not that. What it really is, though, is it's pointing toward this deeper layer of reality that you've described that should tell us the way in which we think things are happening is not really what's happening, that the way that we experience the world isn't as neat and tidy and clean as what we've been taught about how things work. These are little hints that they're worth exploring. Not that you should devote your energy to the ins and outs of vintage Volkswagens, but you should explore what it means if this experience is possible in the face of what you have been told is possible. And I think once you begin doing that, again, it all comes back to this kind of receptivity notion, this openness idea. A lot of other things begin to enter into the equation. And I want to kind of now direct this conversation into how channeling and receiving information from unconventional means ties into the phenomena. What does this mean, and how do we make sense of channeled material, for example, or other things that we're hearing about in the ufological circles that this experience doesn't seem to jive with this one, and how could they be disharmonious? How do we work this out? So how do you fit this way of experiencing and knowing and this modality into the larger picture?
Well, I'm going to begin by saying it's complex. I say that fairly regularly on this show, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
Even discombobulating, perhaps.
Oh, there we go.
Because I think people might want to, make it a black or white issue and say, look, either channeling is as completely accurate, reliable means of obtaining information, like, doing a Google search, or it's hogwash and people's delusion or, delusions of grandeur or whatever, And I think it's just more complicated than that. There's so many nuances and layers to reality and to our own personas, for that matter, that all of these are factors in what ends up happening. So yes, as you say, some people will be like, well, if channeling is accurate and reliable, why did this channeling group get one result and this other channeling group got another result? Well, because there's numerous things going on. Number one, we should say, because I want to cover the gamut here so people feel like we've adequately addressed this. There are some channelers that probably just is hogwash, that either want to say something that will get people's attention so they can garner fame or fortune, perhaps they're thinking, or whatever. Absolutely, there are some people like that. There are other people who genuinely think they're getting something, but perhaps they just are accessing their imagination, or they are, just pulling something from their subconscious. Perhaps because they're not very self-aware, they might have elements come up that feel like it's coming from beyond them, when actually it is actually from them. They're just not very fully integrated as an individual. That can happen too. There's also a degree to which all of us, I would posit, have a higher self, that we are multidimensional beings ourselves. So absolutely, sometimes the information we're getting is from another aspect of ourselves. And we sometimes think about it like the future, but again, space-time is not what we think it is. I don't think really it's the future. That's not the best way to think about it, but it is an aspect of you that has more information that kind of simultaneously is co-arising with you in this particular condition and can actually interact with you in ways that can change your behavior and hopefully influence your behavior. And I think most people, again, maybe if they've never even thought about it this way, when they really sit down and think about it, They'll be, we call it, our better angels, right? Or like an angel and a demon are sitting on my shoulders. Which one do I listen to? This is the kind of conception or metaphor that's been used over time. And certainly that sometimes can be because there are other entities, but sometimes that's also different aspects of ourselves that we're wrestling with and trying to determine what we should do. Even science would tell you that the two hemispheres of our brain are almost like two different personas. You could have a situation where if you're able to, through certain conditions, set up an environment where you can basically speak to one half of the brain, you'll find that brain, that persona from that brain might be an atheist. The other hemisphere might demonstrate strong religious fervor, right? In the same brain, two different hemispheres. And somehow we harmonize it through the corpus callosum, this sense of I'm an individual, I'm a harmonized being. So we're already doing this. We already see evidence of this already, that we're kind of hybrid beings in that sense. And I'm saying that because there's so much evidence that consciousness is non-local, it's not only is it not produced by the physical brain and then the neuronal network of your brain, but neither is it, held there kind of thing. So you can sort of keep scaling out and go further and further. And ultimately, as we already said, everything from any space and any time is available to all of us. Now, we might not be able to practically do that yet or access those degrees of information yet, but it's hypothetically possible, theoretically possible. So I've already mentioned several ways that a certain channeling experience or something claimed to be channeling might not actually be, or might be, but it's a higher version of yourself or something. Because really we're talking about somehow getting into some sort of condition where something beyond your usual understanding of yourself is sending information and it's coming through you, that you're kind of a conduit for it in some ways, whether you keep it to yourself or share it with other people. Now, the next one, of course, is the possibility of other kinds of beings. And so some people, again, getting back to people's preconditions and their preconceptions and their models of reality. So you might have some people who, like a medium, for instance, that is completely coupled with the notion that they can commune with supposedly deceased people, but they might be totally unfamiliar, maybe freaked out by, or think it's preposterous that it could be alien intelligences. So they just assume that everything they're receiving is deceased humans. They're actually not deceased, right? They're in a different modality. And I think that does happen. Absolutely. I've seen remarkable evidence of that. Again, look to Dean Radin's work, look to reincarnation studies. There's so much evidence of this, that death, of course, is not the end. Nothing could be further from the truth, really, when you look at the evidence. So absolutely, we should therefore expect that we're going to be able to have information across that boundary that's actually not this black and white line like we thought it was. But then it goes even further, that there, of course, are many different kinds of intelligences in the cosmos. Let's start with the sort of extraterrestrial kind that are basically 3D like us. They live most of the time, they exist in this sort of matrix-like construct that we call physical reality. They can interact with us. Some of the historical cases in the UFO phenomenon are those kinds of beings. They seem to have mostly technological craft, even if it's a further iteration than what we are able to produce. But they're basically 3D biological beings that also not only have more technological sophistication than us, but they also seem to be further along in understanding consciousness to the point where almost like a technology, they're able to interact with our consciousness. And I've come across evidence that this is both a purely like mind-to-mind thing, and there's also actually tech that has been developed that can manipulate perception and consciousness. We're already seeing signs of us trying to do that, right? Like Elon Musk is trying to put a brain chip in and test how that would augment our capacities, right? So some of these others are able to do that not only with their higher fidelity ability to interact with all of reality, which is ultimately all consciousness, right? We'll get to that in a minute. But they've also developed technology that can also harness the powers of consciousness. And that partly explains why we have such strange experiences with them, and they can mold our behavior and our reactions that we sometimes can't distinguish it from an impulse that arises in our mind normally. And then you have another step beyond that where you have different kinds of dimensional beings. You kind of have the astral field, right? Which is in some ways part of our physical matrix experience, that there's an astral element to that, a field that kind of like is part of that, as sort of an add-on. we also have entities that exist on that kind of field that we can also have interactions with. And that, as I've said many times, this is where our own energy really matters, and us being discerning about our own energy, because the default energy we kind of emit like a light bulb into the cosmos, even the interdimensional cosmos and even the astral aspects of the cosmos, will attract different entities to us. And so if we're projecting a lot of fear or shame or something, then these kind of viral agents can kind of attach to us, just like if we have a weak immune system and we get exposed to some sort of virus. So there's those elements that also can impact us, and we end up channeling some sort of other kind of entity and other kind of intelligence or knowledge because of it. Maybe even to the part where we get, aggravated and kind of seem irritable. It can be because of one of these things, right? Then you go even further and you've got like the multidimensional aspects of reality, where some of these beings are post-biological. They're really not 3D beings at all anymore. And they can get here or get anywhere just by thought alone. They can manifest structures through thought forms. They can interact with our consciousness seamlessly. They can actually interact with every consciousness of every sentient being in the history of the cosmos. They can access those elements of data to do with any space, any time, like the Akashic record or the cosmic memory. They can do all of that. And they also can be channeled by us as well. And I think sometimes some of these ones, and I've kind of pointed to this before, and I'm going to turn it over to you because I know I've gone on for a long time here, but these ones actually look at us like little brothers and sisters, and they know that we're the kind of kindergarten class. We've got to grow our consciousness. We're really primitive in many ways. And this is what happens with all these kind of consciousnesses across the cosmos, all these civilizations, going through this sort of elementary kind of physical, really primitive kind of experience of reality is part of growing up. And I'm talking about growing up as a multidimensional, multi-lifetime, multi-iterative kind of being, right? But they will inspire us. So getting back to the very beginning of our conversation, when you talked about people being inspired technologically or mathematically or musically, right? Or just writing some sort of amazing art, right? Or painting or writing a play. All of these things can also be inspired by them and everything in between that I talked about in a way to help move us forward. And they do it in such a way that we, like, quite deliberately, so that we won't know it's them, because they're kind of the hands-off, let's inspire them, let's let them play, let's let them learn, and we're better off letting them do that without being aware of this greater context. And then eventually they'll get to the point where they can sort of join with the cosmic community. So I would suggest all of those layers are involved and all of those factors.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and you kind of landed where I was going to go anyway. So it's been great tie-in, and that's that. In my opinion, there's a very personal quality to reality, and then there's also a very transpersonal quality to it, and but both of these things are true. That reality and our experience is meant for us, but our awareness is also, it can exceed our bounds as well, and become transpersonal. And so I think when we're talking about, because I think one of the things people might react negatively toward here is that information received from something other than me, the self, feels like it's not, like you're saying you're robbing me of my agency to be the creative in the situation, right? So I didn't create this song. It came from some other intelligence, and it wasn't me at all. And I don't think that's what we're saying here. I think this is a difficult concept to really, in my opinion, in a way, like wrap your head all around, because it's we're hyper individualistic in the way that we think. But what we're kind of getting at here is that reality itself is comprised of this deep well of information of which we are a part of. We are kind of swimming through that, and it's a process of growth of that awareness, of that sort of constituted awareness in that sea of information. And if our personal awareness is really narrow, right? If it's defined in a very narrow, kind of tight beamed way around our notion of self, and what we're doing everything, and this is all about me, then you have what you often have with, like, I think of this as a child who's playing like an imaginary game, right? It's meaningful to the child, but to the rest of everyone else, it doesn't have any meaning or value whatsoever, because their sphere of awareness and understanding is just, it's hyper individualized. It's right where they are, and they've constructed this world around them. But as their sphere of awareness grows over time, and I'm using that word loosely as well, as that expands out, the way in which information is received, its ability to interact with the broader sort of field of information, all of those dynamics grow and change in ways that transcend that individual self, and become, bigger, grander, deeper, so that even your notion of self is changing. And that's really what we're on this journey of doing, right? We're sort of discovering that this is an aspect of ourselves, or an aspect of existence, if you want to put it that way, that we are becoming aware of over time as we progress through this journey. And so, I thought it'd be good to kind of just sort of talk through that a little bit, because I think a lot of folks might have a knee-jerk reaction to some of this, and just thinking, well, like, where am I in all the story? If information is just coming from other places, then what is the part that I play in this situation?
You're right. That's really where you have to go here, and I think we have to address that as well. And that's why it's great that we have this 90-minute format for these episodes, because it's a, dare I say, complex matter, and you really have to sort of ease yourself into it and be willing to upset and reconsider some of your presuppositions about reality, right? And about even who I am. What does that mean, right? There's a couple things I want to get here too, so don't let me forget these. One has to do with a direct kind of knowing versus conceptual knowing. And I also wanted to get into a specific kind of channeling, like the raw material, which, by the way, people, that's RA, not RAW, like raw meat. It's raw. But yes, to this point, initially, who we are, right? What's interesting is, in Vedantic tradition and Buddhist circles, you will often have, like, for instance, Ramana Maharshi, who was a big influence on me spiritually, he would get people to ask this question, who am I? And of course, some people might go in the West, and may be like, well, I'm John Smith, and I'm from Ohio, and, I'm an insurance salesman. What do you mean? Who am I? It's not difficult. And then Ramana would be like, no, who are you really? Separate your experiences, separate your history from the deep sense, the deep felt sense of I amness, right? What's interesting when you start, again, in Buddhist tradition will teach you this, when you start tracing back your history, you realize that, and we've touched on this, many ways we change, right? We're not the same people. Darren and Nathan probably wouldn't have wanted to do the show 20 years ago or 10 years ago, right? So what does that say about them, right? Do they get to say and say, who am I that I'm now in the future doing this crazy show talking about these like outlandish kind of notions, right? That's not fair. That's not me. Where's my sovereignty gone, right? We don't do that, right? Because we have this continuation of time. And so we think that in some ways we kind of, ignorance takes over, and we don't fully stay in touch with how much we change. At least hopefully we should change, I think, if we're really growing. But the point of that exercise that Ramana Maharshi or a Buddhist teacher might take you through is to make you realize that really there is no consistent self, right? There is just experience. So not only is there just experience of I, but even you can eventually get to the point where there's not really even an I there, that all there is experiential reality. And we have a particular lens and a way of framing it. But what we really are is the aliveness of everything, right? And that's why we ultimately have access to everything, because that's what we really are. It's only, in many ways, our conceptions, the framework we bring to it, that limits our ability to experience that. So what I would suggest to people is just by beginning to entertain these notions, broaden your understanding of not just what reality is, but who you are. You begin to experience life differently. Like we've said before, it changes your experience of reality. It changes reality. So this is key. You have to recognize that if it's true that not only am I not the same person I was 5 years ago and 10 years ago, but on top of that, there's this Buddhist koan, Zen koan that will be asked, which is like, what was your face before your parents were born? And we stop and we go, well, no, that's not possible because, there's this linear thing and, they had to be born from their parents and they got together and conceived and that's me. There was no face right before that. That's the conceptual answer, right? But when we really, really feel into, and by feel into, I mean when we get past our conceptions, we get past the default node network, right, of what we've been told and forced and propagandized around, we recognize that there's some sense of I amness, that it's eternal, that it is beyond space and time. And that really it's only because we try to force it into this model that's only been around for a very short period of time, right, a blink of an eye, that we lose that sense. So by opening this up, recognizing that actually it's enabling or it's empowering to recognize that there is ultimately no defined I, right? That there's nothing less noble or inspiring about the notion that some higher version of yourself inspired you with that song, or maybe some collective intelligence of I've talked about having this kind of experience of having a simultaneously existing co-arising aspect of my multidimensional self that's kind of part of this collective civilization. I sometimes can kind of tune into that. I don't personally go, man, I wanted to say I wrote that song, but actually it turns out it's the civilization over there, right? But I don't think that way because I actually experience I amness in that we are-ness, right? Like for me, that is my definition of I at that moment. It's expanded, right? And again, what many of these others keep saying to us is it's your inability to see that you actually are everything and connected to everything that is causing so many of your problems, right? So that's what I would say to that question is rather than thinking that's the final answer, this is exactly what I am, and now you're telling me I'm not the one that did that. No, I'm saying sit with who you are. Ask the question that Ramana Maharshi asked you. Not just who am I, but what is this? And really sit with it to the point where some of the notions you have begin to dissolve around you, almost like the Matrix, like Neo getting unplugged.
Yeah. Well, I know you wanted to touch on some specific, the interplay here between, I guess, this broader understanding that you've articulated and the way that we really are kind of bogged down in this very dense sense of self now. And I want to touch on kind of bringing those ideas together with where we are in this point in time on Earth with the disclosure process, right? Because I think we can kind of extrapolate this highly dense notion of self and kind of mirror that onto this highly dense notion of state and governments and the delineations that human civilization has made in its body, basically, even though we are, as you say, all one, and how that ties together with the disclosure process. Because I think just as we do tend to get wrapped up in this identity issue and the light show of what it is to be embodied in the self, so too disclosure is doing that as well. We're getting wrapped up in the theatrics, in the power aspects of it, and really there's this component to disclosure that is so much broader, that connects in with this channeled idea. And so I don't know, how do you think about this if we're going to overlay these concepts onto kind of what's taking place in the world right now?
Great question again, because I think this is what's most essential about disclosure, actually. That many people will even say to me, because sometimes they'll get the sense that maybe I know some things that are going on internally. And so they'll say, but I don't understand why it's such a big deal. Like, so there's some other biological beings from Zeta Reticuli, like you're telling me that's going to change the world, or that, there's going to be mass panic because of that. And I'll say, maybe not, but that's not what disclosure is. That's not the fullness of it. The fullness of it goes to who we are, our origins, not just because we are an engineered species, which I think is the case. That's seen evidence that seems to be absolutely true. But again, that's only one way of looking at it, because we are ultimately the cosmos. We are ultimately fractal impressions of the original mind, as are the gray aliens and the Nordics and the reptilians and the light beings and the shadow beings. I can go on and on. We are all fractal impressions of the original mind. So, and in that, we are therefore like facets of the same diamond. And yet our civilization lives as if we are separate diamonds or rocks on the road. And that creates a kind of collective insanity, right? Because we are fundamentally acting regularly in ways that defy what actual reality suggests is the case. And that never works well. So you hear about this so often. This has been like the most common warning, admonition, message given to experiencers over time. Not just experiencers of the UFO phenomenon in the last 150 years, but I mean going back into religious history, right? Or what was depicted as a religious event. It's this sense of you've got to raise your consciousness. And that's not just some sort of vague new agey thing like, think about, green trees and rabbits or something, but it's actually saying, find your home, your identity in the all. Recognize not just conceptually that you are one with everything, but actually begin to live somatically and from a heart center that recognizes you are actually part of everything. And as I often say as an example, then taking advantage of someone else or letting greed take over would be as silly to you as like cutting your left arm so your right arm gets more of the, pie or something like that, right? It's ridiculous. And as much as that might sound preposterous to people or kind of a funny example, that's really what's in play here. It's that not only that it's silly that we don't see that, but actually we're doing enormous damage to our civilization, to the planet, to the biosphere, to the point where, again, as I've been suggesting on social media and other podcasts, that's exactly why I think we're seeing heightened intervention. I know that's why we're seeing heightened intervention from some of these others, because it's getting to the point where technologically we've advanced to the point where we're very dangerous, not just to ourselves, but to so much of the larger biome, of which some of which is interdimensional, we're not even aware of yet, right? Just like we talked about junk DNA, we used to like just throw it away and say it's junk, it's garbage, because in our hubris, we just didn't understand it yet. We didn't have the humility to say, yeah, maybe we just don't know yet, In the same way, we detonate atomic bombs thinking we have a really strong sense of what nature is, right? Which that just, again, when you really sit down and think about it, it's kind of preposterous that we would have reached a summit level of understanding, and yet we're like, in splitting the atom, we're like ripping apart the fabric of reality and thinking it's no big deal. Like we'll just, as long as you're outside of the, detonation range, you'll be okay. We're not thinking about some of the other implications. So, all this comes into play, and it's only by disclosure presenting that to us that really we begin to change. And so I would suggest to people who are like hungry for disclosure, thinking, I just want to have the government stop lying to us, because I know they've been here and doing stuff and interacting and even sometimes coordinating with militaries and whatnot. But it's not just that. That's not even actually the big part of it. The consequential part of it is who we are, who they are, and what the whole thing is. And those all work together. And it's really that kind of disclosure that is necessary because we're reaching this precipice. And it also has the potential to really potentially set us on a different course.
Right. So there are kind of two different ways of assessing disclosure, and that's kind of the overt things that are occurring in the revelatory information that's provided, but then there's the deeper underlying meaning behind it. And I wondered if you could speak to, because you touch on this from time to time, and the word that you like to use is discernment. So I want to focus on this for a second. How does someone, kind of survey the information that we're getting right now, and some of it coming through conventional channels, and some of it coming through these non-conventional channels and channel material? Like, how do we look at this and discern and separate, kind of the facts from the fiction here? How do you apply this? Is it just that it kind of rings true to the deeper things that you were just addressing? It resonates with that core message. How do you delineate what is valuable and things that we can disregard here?
Right, because that's what people ask, right? Someone says they claim they've received channel material. How do you make heads or tails of it, right? How do you know one's better than another, right? Isn't it just a bunch of opinions, man? Like from the postmodern perspective, like, who are you to say, man, that that's any more right than what this person said?
Exactly. Or like with the raw material in particular, right? Like, why is raw so good versus something else?
Right, exactly. So I'd say a few things here, but let's begin with the discernment piece. And I want to go back to Buddhism again, and even Vedantic thought too, because in those traditions, there's this notion of a kind of direct knowing, where you're sort of touching base with source, versus conceptual knowing. And in the West, those really are not distinguished. There really isn't even a sense of there being such a thing as direct knowing. That there's this notion there is no knowing outside of conception, but that's actually not at all true. And as you've attested to when I've sort of suggested certain books to you from Eastern traditions, it takes a while to begin to retrain your brain to even begin to possibly, and the irony is here, not really think this way, but to stop the usual thinking long enough to realize some other information is arising. So, and even in that non-conventional state experience you had, same idea, right? You came to me and said, wow, I mean, this was fundamentally different than any other way I've received information, but this felt more real and more true and more direct, right? So that's part of it, is recognizing that there is such a thing as direct knowing. And what, the historical Buddha taught was that this is possible for all human beings. So he would say, unlike some other religious traditions, that said, believe me because I'm the son of God, or I'm this or that. I'm not saying Jesus said that. That was actually kind of how he was framed. But I'm saying what the Buddha said was, test this for yourself. If this is true, then you'll be able to demonstrate it for yourself. You don't have to listen to my words, because again, we're all connected. We're all source. If you get the obstacles out of the way, you will just see that this has always been the case. And this gets back to what we've talked before about, we are all the Buddha, in potentially, right? We just have to realize it, basically. And also, there is no such thing as a 100% perfectly psychic person. Because again, of all those things we said, right? We all have egos at different levels of development. We all maybe get impacted by, we didn't have a great breakfast and we're feeling weird. Something happened yesterday with someone that, was really, hanging on me, energetically. All of that's going to impact how we receive any kind of information and process it, including this kind of psychic information or channeling information. So if a psychic comes to you and says, or a channel comes to you and says, this is 100% accurate all the time, there's never any need to worry about other things getting in the way, don't trust them. Like, I would not trust that. And people who do practice these things regularly will willingly admit that that's part of it. It's just part of the human condition with any kind of information. When we, even things in the West that we think we really are objectively validating or discerning through like objective means, we know it's not true, right? Like we talked before about, when we study somatic response, we find that we actually, some part of our body has made a decision before we've ever got to the point where we rationally justify it, right? But so we actually twist reality to fit this model rather than, let the reality dictate the model in some ways. So discernment is about also if like the old saying, if someone says jump off a bridge, do you do it? Or if like 3 people jump off a bridge, does that mean you should do it? No, you should discern. What's the fruit of this action going to be? So if a supposed higher version of yourself or an extraterrestrial intelligence is saying to you, you should do this, weigh it, think about it, sit on it, meditate on it, talk to other people about it. Think about what the implications of that action would be and use your common sense. I mean, just because this is non-conventional information, which again, I think eventually we'll get to a point where we realize that's the wrong notion. This is completely conventional, actually. But because it's completely conventional, just an expanded sense of convention, we should apply the same common sense rules we do everywhere else. And so I want to tie that in with the raw material specifically, because one of the ways that the raw material really rings true to me is because I hear that oneness message, for number one. It was not the first time I heard the oneness message, right? I've already been convinced of that from my own experience when I've dropped into the deepest levels of who I am, where I'm in that bedrock where everything's connected, right? Then that I can attest that is truth at that point. And I don't mean it conceptually sounds like a good idea. I mean, you resonate with it. It's almost like a harmonic resonance, right? It's a different way of experiencing truth, and truth in sense of reality, not an abstraction. So I had already come to that conclusion, as so many people from Buddhist, Vedantic, non-dual traditions have come to, is that everything's connected. And of course, science is pointing in that direction too, that even with quantum theory, we realize there's not really these discrete things. There's more like a field that sometimes takes on the appearance of what looks like a thing, but really it's just an excitation of the field, or as Bernardo Kastrup, an excitation of consciousness, right? There isn't really a whirlpool. There's just a river that's exciting in such a way as to look like a whirlpool temporarily. And that's what we are as well. And that doesn't make us any less ultimately real, actually, because this happens all the way up and all the way down. And this is just how consciousness can subsume all of these other categories of existence. So again, getting back to the raw material, there's several things that in that particular case make it seem trustworthy to me. Number one, there's the overarching oneness message. There's also descriptions of our history that fit with other things I've corroborated about our history. There's truths told about different kinds of alien intelligences and how it's not always love and light. There is love and light, but there's also these ones that are more, at a lower level of consciousness themselves. Even if they're at a higher level than us, even dimensionally, sometimes they're still working from that kind of sense of separation. And that makes them take advantage of species, just like we tend to do that with certain societies we go into, right? Or nation states. So in other words, the metaphysical picture or the astral political picture fits with other things I've seen. So in other words, I'm corroborating this with my own experiences, with things I'm reading and hearing elsewhere. I also trust the people that were involved, that they actually were very ego-less. They really had done their work, had done shadow work. They had cleared out as much of the impurities as possible so that a more pure source of information could come through. In fact, the raw group will even say that's why they picked that group, because they were capable of actually receiving this, because there was kind of this cleanliness there, this clean channel, right? But also, like I said, because the oneness thing fits with things I've learned elsewhere. So, and it also even is corroborated by other channel material too. Like you'll often, and then this is key too, you have to be able to get past some of the language sometimes. You have to be able to get past some superficial differences. You have to recognize it's never going to be 100%. You're always going to have some impurities or other things that get mixed in because it's passing through multiple layers of reality. But fundamentally, it's very sound. That's what I would say. So these are the kind of tools I would say we need to bring to bear when we're trying to make sense of these things. And when we do, we really can and should, I would say, learn from these things, because this is an immense treasure trove of information that is absolutely true, even if it's sometimes only partially true because some impurities get in. But when we begin to really draw from these sources of information and put them through those discernment filters we just talked about, then really we begin to not only transform our civilization with that information, but we begin to actually realize what it's like to be in contact with these greater, expansive elements of reality in ways that we don't even dream of yet.
Yeah, and on that note, I want to kind of speak a little bit to the experiment here that is liminal frames. That it is it very much is a we space, and I not only as I speak with you during these recordings, but outside of them, when we meet or when I'm thinking about the show, I think about not just the two of us. I think about all that goes into what this is. The listener experience, the impact of the topic, the downstream effect of having the conversation, both on our own selves personally, but on our own interpersonal relationships with other individuals. Like, this is an example, just like every human relationship is, of what we've been talking about tonight. And that is that, from a certain vantage point, if you allow it, right? This is the thing, it's just a reminder. It's there for you all the time. You just have to allow yourself to perceive it and participate in it. And if we can take a moment to just be present to the totality of this experience, not just the words that you're hearing, not just the place where you're sitting or what you're doing, going about your day, but the sphere, the scope of this interaction, you begin to see and appreciate how deep this really goes, and how much it transcends. And I'm not just saying this show, I'm just saying that your lived experience, the scope doesn't really end. It's just you have to be willing to perceive it. And when you do that, when you start, as we talked about earlier, when you play with this idea, when you flex this muscle and train it, it absolutely responds and grows. And you can toggle it. You can kind of turn it on and turn it off, and be present and not present to it. And there are good things about both, right? You should, I think that's another thing people should kind of hopefully hear is we're not kind of being down on, being hyper personalized. Like, that's part of the experience. We can't have one without the other. But just to say that we've gotten to a place in the world now where we've spent so much energy and time focused on the I, the me, that we've lost sight of the rest of it all. And I think we, to our great detriment. So we're asking that we just redeem that. We bring it back into experience and watch, when doing that, how everything transforms.
Well said. And I would say we all, I think, have had practical experiences where we enjoy that sense of we space, right? Whether it's, you've played in a band, whether it's like, a 4-piece rock band or an orchestra, and you become part of, and you're caught up in something so much larger than yourself. And you feel this like vibrant, expansive aliveness right in that. Same thing, if you're on stage in a Shakespearean play and you're caught up in like the drama all together, and then all these pieces are pulling together to create this experiential kind of presentation for people, and you're part of the audience too, gets part of it too, right? And everybody feels that, and you've talked about this before being at concerts, right? Everybody feels this immense aliveness, and we sometimes feel most alive in those moments. And if you think about it, those are the times where we're least individualistic, right? So we, I think, practically have these experiences where when we really think about it, we sit down and think about it, we go, I don't know about this rugged individualism thing, because actually where I feel most profound, most myself, is when I'm beyond myself, when I'm part of something else. And I would suggest that not only can we experience that as human beings, but what we're on the cusp of is the possibility space where we can begin to experience that we space with a whole assortment of other beings as well. That's really what's in play, and that's why it's such a exciting time to be alive.
a gift just waiting for us to receive it. Well, thank you all for listening and joining us this evening, or wherever time it may be. We really enjoy having this conversation with you, and look forward to the interactions that come from it. We wish all of you well. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.